Olá, boa tarde. Vou mudar para inglês para o Peng seguir melhor, apesar de que ele já está a ficar muito proficiente no português. Peng got his PhD in 2021 from University Pompeu Fabra. After he worked as a postdoc fellow at University of Oslo and later at BCBL. He joined CLUL in 2025 with an assistant research contract under SEG. His research focused on bilingualism and L2 acquisition, especially in the development of multimodal training for L2 phonetic and prosodic learner. Recently, he has been awarded a Marie Curie Fellowship with his project Muse Pro that will explore an innovative training approach for learning second language prosody. Today he's going to talk about Mandarin speakers in Spain. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing. So today I'm going to talk about longitudinal studies that I have done during my stay in Spain with several colleagues. So it's on the phonological development, and we focus on the group of studied group of people, that is Mandarin speakers learning Spanish. So why do we do study abroad? Because we know that study abroad actually entails intensive and naturalistic L2 exposure, which is supposedly to be beneficial for the to improve the L2 proficiency. However, in the field of phonological development, we find that there are the gains are not always guaranteed. In some studies you can find some improvement, but some studies do not really support the beneficial role of study abroad. And especially these kind of studies are done by group comparison. Usually they have a study abroad group in comparison with the at-home group. So on the group level, we do not see consistent results. But here we consider that individual differences may largely constrain the benefits of study abroad. So within all the candidates of individual difference factors, we will focus on two factors. The first one is auditory processing ability. This is an emerging factor in the recent studies showing that how the sensitivity of people's auditory processing ability to the sound change can actually constrain the successful learning outcome. The second one is classic L2 use. Even though we are all in the same country, we are all in the same study program, it doesn't mean that we have the equal amount of L2 use. Some people may actively seek a chance to speak to native speakers, others will be more conservative. Okay? So these two factors will be our key individual measures. Apart from that, we will also try to investigate the development pattern of perception and production link. Because the participants in our study, they change their learning scenario from the classroom teaching to naturalistic immersion. In this new scenario, they may try to develop their perception and production modalities in a different way. So this is also one of the goals of the current study. So in this study, we will focus on two domains. On the segmental domain, we selected stop voicing as the learning target. And this entails a new category formation. On the suprasegmental domain, we selected lexical stress as the window to observe the development. So we know that here in lexical stress, you have multiple cues to perceive and to produce the contrast. So this entails a cue weighting shift towards the L2 norm, which is a gradient shift. And as we have said, the target language is Spanish, and the target group will be L1 Mandarin speakers. So now let's first look at the stop voicing. We know that Spanish is a voicing language. This means that it contrasts the voiced versus voiceless consonants. Okay? So the voiced consonants, typically you start your voicing before the the stop release. So here, if we consider stop release as 0, then if you start vibrating your vocal fold, then this will give you a negative voice onset time. Okay? Then the voiceless consonant, typically in Spanish, it is categorized by a short lag VOT, which means that you start the vibration, the vocal fold vibration shortly after the stop release. Okay, but Mandarin is not in this category. Mandarin does not have a voiced consonant. We only have a voiceless consonant, and we contrasted the consonant by aspiration. So we have unaspirated consonants and aspirated consonants. So the unaspirated consonant behaves quite similar to the Spanish voiceless consonant. But for the aspirated consonant, we have a long lag VOT. Okay, so this is the contrast between two languages. Because we do not have the voiced consonant category, Mandarin speakers typically assimilate the voiced and the voiceless consonant to the unaspirated category. This is a very classic single category assimilation pattern according to Peng Li 2. So if we quantify the stops on the continuum of VOT, we can see that the main challenge for the Mandarin speakers is to form a new category that is called voiced consonant or voiced stops. And so here we are expecting a categorical change after study abroad. Next, let's look at the word level prosody. We know that Spanish is a lexical stress language and Mandarin is a lexical tone language. So we have 4 tones in Mandarin to contrast the meaning on the syllable level. But we also have kind of a stress system. Okay, so I'm going to show you this. This is a minimal pair contrast. When you pronounce dong, xi, this means east and west. But if you pronounce dong, xi, so you can hear that xi is kind of weak, right? So this means something or a thing. Okay, so we also have something similar to lexical stress. And you can see that, when the xi is pronounced in the full syllable, it's longer than the xi pronounced in the neutral tone, which behaves similar to an unstressed syllable. But at the same time, you can also see that the contour, the pitch contour is different. We have a flat tone in the full syllable, but kind of a falling tone in this neutral syllable. Okay? Therefore, for Chinese or for Mandarin, F0 and the pitch is the main acoustic cue on the word level prosody, whereas duration also participates in this play, but it's a secondary. By contrast, the Spanish is a lexical stress language, and in isolated words, the stressed syllable is always cued by higher pitch, longer duration, stronger intensity, things like that. But if you put the isolated word into sentence, the cues are not always maintained. So for instance, in this sentence, we can try to play it.
¿Le dieron el número de vuelo?
Okay, so if you focus on the prenuclear word dieron, let's listen to it again.
¿Dieron?
Okay, you can see that die is long but low. Rong is short but high. But for Spanish people, this doesn't matter. The pitch peak actually delays in the unstressed syllable. They still consider the long syllable is unstressed. Why? Because the die is longer. Here, duration in sentence may play a main role to distinguish the lexical stress than F0 cues. So now the challenge is clear. The learners must learn to shift from their pitch cue reliance to duration cue reliance after study abroad, which entails a gradient shift. So bearing all this in mind, we have our research questions. The first research question, we focus on the new phonetic category formation. Then we ask whether study abroad may help the phonetic category formation, and we focus on the perception and the production of stop voicing. And we also want to know how do individual differences affect this procedure, this learning scenario, and we focus on auditory acuity and L2 use. The second research question, we asked about the Q-weighting shift on the suprasegmental domain. So we want to see if study abroad can shift the Q-weighting preference for the lexical stress contrast. Again, we focus on perception and the production. We also take the Q-weighting as a window to observe the change in perception-production link after study abroad. Okay, so this is the main research question. Now let's look at our participants and the study design. First, we recruited 30 people for the experimental group, and they are all Mandarin speakers, and their Spanish proficiency ranges from B1 to C1. Most of them are like B2 speakers. And they learned an MA program in Spain and for 1 year. However, this MA program does not focus on Spanish language per se. It's instructed in Spanish. And they had learned Spanish for almost 4 years before coming to Spain at Chinese universities. So they are Spanish majors. But they had no study abroad experience before coming to Spain. Okay. Then as a baseline group, we recruited 19 Spanish native speakers, and they are Castilian Spanish speakers, and they are not monolingual, of course, but they use Spanish as their native and dominant language. So we have like 2 tests for the experimental group, and we tested the Spanish natives only once. So the T1 is upon arrival at Spain, we tested the participants' perception and the production, also the pitch and the duration acuity in this for the auditory processing score. Then before they leave Spain after 1 year of study abroad, we repeated the same perception and production task, and we added an L2 use questionnaire to know how actively they speak and listening to Spanish. So first, I'm gonna report the study on stop voicing. So this was in collaboration with Xiaotong Xi and Christine Shea. They are in China and the US, and one of the paper has been published, and the other one is under review right now. So in this study, we will report the perception and the production respectively. So first, for the perception task, we selected 3 pairs of Spanish words, like beso, beso, dia, dia, goma, goma. Okay, they only contrasted in the stop voicing in the word initial position. So we manipulated the VOT of the initial consonant from the -60 to +60, which represents the typical voicing consonant until the borderline of voiceless consonant. That is, if it's over 60, you may hear it as aspirated, which is not the case of Spanish. We also followed. This is following previous research, Garcia's study in language and speech. So exactly the same pattern. So after the manipulation, we played the stimuli to the participants and asked them to judge whether they heard a beso or beso, dia or dia, things like this. So this is a 2 alternative forced choice study task, and we coded their answers as voiced 0, voiceless 1, so binary coding, and all the stimuli were repeated 4 times. So now let's look at the group results. So on the y-axis, we show the proportion of voiceless response. On the x-axis, we show the VOT value. And the native speakers are shown in this blue curve. And we can see that the native speakers, the crossover point at 50% for the native speakers is almost when the VOT equals 0. This means that after, if the VOT is greater than 0, they think that this is a voiceless consonant, otherwise it's voiced. But for Chinese speakers, we see that their perceptual boundary is almost 20. Actually, it was around 17. And there is no significant change in the steepness of the slope before study abroad and after study abroad. Okay, and there is a significant difference between the learners and the native speakers. So the T2 slope still significantly shallower than the native speakers, which means that they are not so certain about their choice, okay, not so categorical. And we do not see a significant improvement in the boundary location, okay, and no significant change. This is not surprising, although frustrating, because we know that this is, in previous research, people also find similar things. But the story is completely different if we consider individual difference. So the first individual difference is the auditory acuity in duration. Why duration? Because VOT is a durational measure. Okay, so let's listen to this. Okay, you need to tell whether the first sound is different from the second one or the third sound is different from the second one. So here the answer should be 3. And after this, we played many trials to them, and after this experiment, we got the duration discrimination score. Okay, so here is how the duration discrimination score interferes with the study abroad effect. So in the left panel, I plot the regression lines of low duration acuity group. This is, we didn't do a group split. We didn't split the participants. This is just the regression line at the -1 standard deviation. Okay. The blue line always indicates the native speakers. And we can see that for the low acuity group, there is a decrease from T1 to T2 in the steepness of the perceptual slope, whereas this pattern is reversed in the high duration acuity group. Okay, so therefore, better duration acuity can give sharper slope or more categorical perceptual pattern. But we do not find any significant change in the, boundary location. In the boundary location here. Okay, the next one is the L2 use questionnaire, which was administered at T2. And we asked the participants to estimate the total hour they spent on listening to Spanish or listening to Mandarin during their study abroad. And we surveyed a lot of activities, and I'm not going to read a lot of this, but this questionnaire was quite long, and they need to recall all the details in their one-year experience. So the key point is how do we measure the L2 input? So we took a ratio between the total hours of speaking Spanish and the total hours of speaking Mandarin. So to normalize the individual biases in the time estimation. And so this is actually telling people how frequently they speak the L2 relative to L1. Now, if we put this score into the model, and we can see a very similar pattern to the auditory processing ability. So again, there is a significant decrease from T1 to T2 in the low L2 input group. And this is not the case for the high L2 input group. But if you remember the previous figure, you will see that although more L2 input can lead to sharper slope or more categorical perception pattern, it's not as strong as the auditory acuity. Okay. What I present here are all based on statistical analysis, which are significant. Okay. The last thing, the next thing we're going to present is the production task. So for the production task, we designed a dialogue reading task. Why dialogue reading? Because in this task, we embedded almost all the challenging phonemes of Spanish to this task, so that the participants are not aware of our target. They would not commit to hyperarticulation. And also, this kind of design can allow us to manipulate the speech prominence. So look at sentence A. Who eats the pineapple? So if you answer this question, you would say Belén eats the pineapple. You put the emphasis on Belén. So the next one is like Belén eats the pear. No, Belén eats the pineapple. So this time you put the focus on pineapple. Therefore, we can change the speech prominence condition. Also, you can see that Benin, the target word, the target sound B is in an unstressed syllable, but Binya is in a stressed syllable. So using this kind of design, we can well control the phonetic context or the phonetic factors that may affect the voice onset time. Okay, so in this case, we got in total 48 target words, or target sound for each participant. We analyzed the VOT of the stops. So here is the result. So on the y-axis, we plot the VOT. On the x-axis, we plot each sound. And the left panel, voiced consonant, right panel, voiceless consonant. And still, the blue color always indicates native speaker. And we can see there is a huge difference between the natives and the learners, especially in the voiced consonant, and barely no change from T1 to T2. Yeah, this is true. Statistically, there is no significant finding here. And almost all the sounds, they are still significantly different from the native speakers. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is to do group individual level analysis. So here we use the L2 speaking score. L2 speaking score is surveyed in the same questionnaire, and we also surveyed the participants' total hour of speaking Spanish and Mandarin in different activities. And again, we took the ratio to get the L2 speaking use score. Okay, so this is how frequently you speak Spanish relative to Mandarin during your study abroad. So now let's look at the result. So for this analysis, we only take the T2 data. So the y-axis actually indicates the T2 data, the T2 VOT. And the x-axis is the L2 speaking score, okay? And you can see that we have three pairs, BP, TD, and PG, plotted in three different panels. And we found significant interaction between the voicing and L2 L2 speaking score for the BP and the TD contrast. But it's not the case for the KG contrast. So specifically, if you are checking the voiceless consonant, which is not the non-native consonant, L2 use score does not really predict their VOT. But L2 use score actually predicts their pronunciation of the voiced consonant. As a consequence, if you speak more during your study abroad, you are producing the two sounds more separately. Okay, so this holds for BP and the TD sounds at the end of the study abroad. So we could not find a significant effect on the K and the G. Perhaps this is because of the articulatory constraints, and the pronunciation is more backward in the velar position. Okay, is this all clear? Okay, so let's move on to the interim summary. So first of all, we did not find, study abroad to be a robust, thing on the group level, and it only gave limited change from T1 to T2. And we therefore consider that a longer immersion period or phonetic training would be necessary, which has been backed up by some recent studies. And we find L1 specific effects that is different from the English native speakers. Mandarin speakers are behaving differently. It's harder for us to get to acquire the voiced stops because English is not a pure aspirating language. We find as for the individual differences, we find that better auditory acuity can lead to more categorical perceptual pattern, and also more frequent L2 speaking can give better production as the participants are splitting the single category assimilation into two category assimilation as they increase their L2 speaking rate. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this is the stop voicing study. So the next study I'm going to present is the lexical stress study. This is in collaboration with Xiaotong Xi and Clara Martin when I was in Spain. Again, one paper published, the other one is still under review. We are in the long queue. So first I'm going to present the design of the stress perception task. This is kind of complicated. I will try my best to make it easier. So we designed one sentence for la palabra paso in contrast with the other one, por la plaza pasó. So in Spanish, paso and pasó are minimal pair words contrasting only in lexical stress, but the grammatical meaning is different. Paso means that I passed through something, but pasó means that he or she passed. So the tense and the subject noun is different. We manipulated the duration and the F0 of the a and o. So from this end, the a is quite low, and then it is much lower than the o. And here, the a is much higher than o. So along this scale, you will see that the perceptual pattern, the lexical stress pattern will be from weak strong to strong weak. And the same thing holds for the duration difference score. Okay? So in this case, we will get a very nice grade. So this area is the typical basal area because both cues are telling you that this is weak strong. And let's listen to this.
Por la plaza pasó.
Okay? By contrast, this area is the typical basal area because both cues are telling you that it's a strong weak.
Por la plaza pasó.
Okay? However, the rest two corners are the conflicting corners, where one cue favors strong weak pattern, the other cue favors the opposite. Okay.
Por la plaza pasó.
Okay.
Por la plaza pasó.
I don't know how you consider this, but for me, I'm super biased by the pitch. I just don't really care about the duration. So in the central position, there is no cue available. Listen.
Por la plaza pasó.
Okay. So we are expecting a random guess here. So as we have 7 steps each, then we have this nice grade, and we will have like 49 stimuli. So we played the 49 stimuli to the participants in random order, and they were told that you must choose the subject noun to complete this sentence. We told that this sentence is incomplete. So if they choose yo, this means that they think they heard strong, weak. Otherwise, this means that they heard weak, strong. So again, 4 repetitions. Now let's look at the descriptive figure. So first, a heat map. This heat map, we show pitch step on x-axis, duration step on y-axis, and you can and the color darkness means the percentage of strong weak perception pattern. And you can see that Spanish people are highly biased by duration. And this is not the case of Chinese people at T1 or at T2. We are more biased towards the right end, right? Okay, so this is the descriptive data. Now let's look at the statistic result. So the slopes. So this is the pitch panel. Again, native speakers are plotted in blue, and the y-axis, the x-axis shows the pitch step. And we can see that after study abroad, Chinese speakers relied more on pitch, and this increase is significant. And it's true that Spanish people showed a shallower, perceptual slope on this pitch panel. By contrast, in the duration panel, Spanish speakers showed more reliance on duration, and there is still a significant improvement from T1 to T2 for the learners, but to a lesser degree. Okay, is this clear right now? Yeah. So both pitch and the duration cue weighting increased after study abroad, but pitch is still dominant. We do see a slight change, towards the duration cue weighting. Next, let's see the stress production data. Again, we used the dialogue reading task, and actually the dialogue reading task was very long, so we had different, phonemes embedded there. So we just take out the relevant vowel. So the idea is the same. We want to manipulate the stress condition and prominence condition by this conversation. And we extracted the F0 and the duration of the target vowels after the data annotation. And you can see here we put the target vowel between voiceless consonants most of the case. This can give us a clear boundary of the vowel so that we will estimate their duration more accurately. So now this is the result. The left panel shows the pitch, right panel or the F0. The right panel shows the duration. On the y-axis, we show the corresponding acoustic measure. On the x-axis, we show stress versus unstress. And still, blue color, native speaker. And we can see that if we look at the pitch panel, we'll see the Spanish speakers do not really show as exaggerated pitch difference as Chinese speakers do. Okay, and we find a significant decrease in the F0 on the stress syllable in the learners. This means that after study abroad, they realize that you don't have to be so high to produce lexical stress. Okay, it's okay to lower your tone, and we do not see any significant change in the unstressed syllable because they are sufficiently low right now. And so here, the main conclusion is that from T1 to T2, the participants lowered their F0 on the stressed syllable. But in the duration panel, we do see some, decrease or something, but these changes are not significant. So we do not have any significant change in the duration dimension. Okay, next let's look at the perception-production link. Before everything, I need to introduce how did we calculate the Q weighting. So for the perceptual Q weighting, we did logistic regression analysis on each of the participants. So the dependent variable is the binary coded response. The independent variable is included the pitch step and the duration step. So in this way, we can get two coefficients from the logistic model, a logistic regression model, one for duration, one for pitch. For the production data, we did a linear discriminant analysis. So the dependent variable is stressed versus unstressed. The independent variables included normalized F0 and duration for each participant. Again, we got two coefficients, one for duration, one for pitch. What did we do with these coefficients for each participant? We further calculated the Q weighting score with this formula. So if you inspect this formula, you will see that if after the calculation, if I got my Q weighting score of 0.7, this means that I'm highly biased by pitch. I'm using pitch a lot. Okay, so this formula can guarantee a range from 0 to 1. So in this calculation, 0 means that someone only rely on duration, totally discard. Totally discard the pitch Q. And if it's 1, then the pattern is opposite. 0.5 means that they have equal Q weighting. Okay? With this measure, we could do the next step to observe the perception and the production link. So the perceptual Q weighting score actually quantifies how, to what extent one relies on one Q over the other Q to perceive the lexical stress. And the production Q weighting does the same thing in the production domain. So we predict the production Q weighting with the perception Q weighting with the interaction with the time. Okay, so now we have this result. On the y-axis, we show the production. On the x-axis, we show the perception. And the test is color-coded. Let's look at the light color. This is the T1. We find a significant positive correlation between perception and production. This means that if you use more pitch in perception, you tend to do so in production. But this significant correlation disappeared at T2. So you can see there's quite a flat regression line. So what does that mean? Study abroad actually caused the association between the two modalities. Okay, let's do a summary. Different from the stop voicing contrast, we found moderate effect of study abroad. So specifically, we found a more categorical perceptual pattern after study abroad. pitch still remains dominant. This is, this may be a lifelong thing. But we find some, more reliance on duration for perception and less reliance on pitch for the production. And this also correlates to the de-associated or the decoupled perception-production link. So I will go back to this later in the conclusion section. So the main message here is that suprasegmental learning is less categorical than segmental learning, and we can expect some gradient change, which may be easier for us to detect some effects. Okay, first let's answer to all the research questions. In the first research question about new category formation, and we see that study abroad alone is not enough on the group level. For perception, we see that individuals with good auditory acuity tend to have more improvement than those who with bad auditory acuity. And auditory acuity is a better predictor than L2 use in listening. And for production, we see that L2 speaking frequency significantly predicted how they separate the single category into two categories in the stop voicing contrast. For cue weighting shift on the suprasegmental level, we see that study abroad can lead to moderate rereading of the cues in both domains. This, but the perception and production did not develop in the same direction. That's why we observed dissociation after a study abroad. So now the conclusions. First, it's clear that L2 phonological system does not reorganize in the same way. Suprasegmental learning is more, gradient than the segmental learning. Therefore, it allows us to detect more, meaningful changes statistically. Individual differences largely drive the gains or the development during study abroad. Here we see that the auditory processing and L2 use both are important factors. The restructuring of the L2 phonological system is not synchronous across domains. This validates the hypothesis formulated by Nagel and Weisberg in their recent review. So basically, if people change their learning scenario from one setting to a new setting, to the other setting, they have, since the L2 learners are adults, they are not monolinguals. They have a lot of language experiences. They will have a lot of cognitive or experiential resources to support their reorganization of perception and production. Therefore, they do not necessarily reorganize the two modalities in the same way. That's why we may observe a dissociation at the beginning or in a short period of time. Because this study is only 1 year, we only have 1 year observation, the participants may on their way to reorganize the perception and the production modality. But if you give them sufficient time, let's say 5 years or something, they may find a way to realign the two modalities. But to validate this hypothesis, we need a longer, longitudinal design. The current data cannot really answer this. The last message I want to convey is that the language pairing is really important for this field. We find in the previous research, English is always there. It's either the target or the speakers or the learner's native language, because it's going to be easier to do. You don't have a third language, comes to play. But it's also possible. For instance, all our participants speak English as a second language. Spanish is actually their third language. But English here does not really interfere a lot, because English is also lexical stress language, right? English does not have a stop voicing contrast. Therefore, we can still consider that Spanish is their L2 in the specific cases. Then we find different learning patterns from the English native speakers. In some previous study, we can find that the English speakers can improve very fast. In Garcia's study, during like a 7-week immersion program, some English speakers already, displayed native-like perceptual pattern. This is not the case for Chinese, because they started in a very, leftward, how to say that, the categorical boundary. Also, from some previous training studies, some English speakers can reach native-like production after a 1 semester training or something, but this is also hard for Chinese speakers. So the language specificity here plays a major role. Okay, so here is the end of my presentation. Thank you for coming here, and I also thank the grants, many grants from different agencies. Thank you.